We're looking at how one of the top global economies in the world has morphed into what some of its own residents are literally calling a broken reality, a living nightmare. We've got some incredible on-the-ground reporting and data to help us unpack this massive gap between national wealth and everyday survival. So, get comfortable and let's just get right into it. Okay, let's start with the human stakes here, because they are very real. Listen to this visceral quote from Kirsty Murray. She's a mom living in state housing in Hull. That's a working-class coastal city in England's northeast. Kirsty is actually skipping her own meals just to make sure her disabled teenage son has enough to eat. And when that bitterly cold English winter hits, she doesn't turn on the heat. There's no way. They bring down the quilts and literally sit in bed just to stay warm. When asked about her situation, she said, "I would literally pack up and go because it's a walking nightmare." That's not hyperbole, folks. That's her everyday survival. Section 1, the wealth paradox. So, how does this actually happen? Well, the most crucial thing to grasp here is that Kirsty's reality, it's absolutely not an isolated anecdote. It's actually part of a massive systemic contradiction that is sweeping across the UK right now. Let's zoom out and look at the sheer scale of this. 14 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of people currently living in poverty in the United Kingdom. To put that into perspective, we're talking about roughly 21% of the entire UK population. That's more than 1 in 5 people waking up every single day to the harsh reality of just not having enough to get by. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the paradox. On a macro level, the UK is the 6th richest country in the world. It's an absolute economic powerhouse. But the micro reality? Completely different story. In specific local areas like Hull, you're looking at over 50% of kids living below the poverty line. Take Jan Boyd, for instance. She's run a local food bank for almost a decade, where folks can grab 4 items once a week for just £1. But as she rightly points out, places like hers shouldn't need to exist. I mean, in the 6th richest country on earth, nobody should be forced to choose between heating their home and feeding their kids, right? Now, for our international viewers, to really put this regional wealth divide into context, consider this mind-blowing revelation. If you completely removed London from the equation, the United Kingdom's GDP would actually be lower than that of the poorest state in the US, Mississippi. It's wild, right? It perfectly demonstrates how incredibly centralized the UK's wealth really is. The economic power is hyper-concentrated in London, the seat of power, while the rest of the country, especially the north, is just deeply struggling. Section 2, roots of the crisis. You know, the natural question you gotta ask when looking at data like that is, how exactly does a wealthy nation arrive at this point? To figure that out, we need to zoom out historically and look at the economic dominoes that fell to create the exact crisis we're seeing today. Because this absolutely did not happen overnight. Back in the 1970s, the UK was heavily industrialized, with manufacturing making up 30% of the GDP. But then, rolling into the 1980s under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a lot of that industry was offshored. The economy did a massive pivot toward finance in central London, coupled with tax cuts that favored the affluent. Fast forward to the 2008 market crash, that brought huge cuts to local councils and public services. And then, you layer on the post-COVID reality of skyrocketing inflation. So what we're really looking at is decades of deindustrialization and underinvestment in the north, all compounding over time. You can really grasp the sheer scale of this economic shift when you realize manufacturing went from driving 30% of the economy down to a mere 8% today. Just imagine the massive economic void that leaves behind. We're talking about generations of job losses in working-class communities, and those opportunities were never really replaced. And the real crux of the issue is captured in this tiny metric, 0.6%. That represents the UK's sluggish annual productivity growth since the 2008 crash. For context, before the crash, it was growing at around 2% a year. When your productivity growth basically stalls out at 0.6%, and you combine that with real wages going backward, plus post-COVID inflation making everyday goods wildly expensive, it absolutely devastates the living standards of the working class. No question about it. Section 3, the populist surge. Look, when people feel this intense level of economic despair, and they feel totally left behind by the political establishment in London, a political vacuum opens up fast. And right now in the UK, that vacuum is definitely being filled. Enter the Reform Party. This is a populist political movement that is actively promising a speedy fix for citizens who are deeply disillusioned with the establishment status quo. Led by Nigel Farage, this party is a direct political reaction to the exact economic despair we've just charted out. And recent polls are showing massive momentum for reform, largely because traditional party support is collapsing, as voters just lose patience. Now, what's really interesting here is the fierce, polarized debate going on. Nigel Farage, as you might know, was one of the most high-profile advocates for Brexit. While some analysts argue that leaving the EU helped drive up inflation and economic struggles, Farage strongly counters that narrative. He argues that the opposite is true, that since leaving the EU, they're in control of their own laws again, and blaming Brexit for the current problems is, quote, absolutely wrong. This perfectly illustrates the wildly contrasting perspectives out there on how to diagnose and fix the economy right now. So let's look at how this messaging is actually cutting through on the ground. Hull has historically been a traditional Labour Party heartland, but recently, the city elected a Reform Party mayor, Luke Campbell. Get this, he's a former Olympic gold medal boxer with absolutely zero previous political experience. None. He was elected specifically because, in his own words, voters were fed up and simply wanted something different. It really shows us that frustrated voters aren't just sitting back complaining. They're actively going to the ballot box and choosing highly unconventional candidates to try and shake the system up. Section 4. Can it be fixed? Which brings us to the final and probably most crucial theme of our explainer. With all these deep-seated generational problems, what are the actual solutions being proposed by the traditional political establishment? Well, looking at the competing pledges, on one side, you have the government promising to increase the minimum wage, build more homes, and invest heavily in infrastructure to create high-paying jobs. On the flip side, conservative opponents are pledging to reduce taxes, end stamp duty, and lower migration to ease the pressure on housing and infrastructure. Both sides definitely have their blueprints, but here's the catch. Political analysts and economists across the board pretty much agree on one sobering reality. The problems in this country are so deeply rooted that fixing them is going to require immense time and a massive amount of public patience. But, that brings our explainer full circle right back to Kirsty Murray in Hull. Her response to all those political pledges is painfully clear. Until you've lived it, you don't know. It's all right making these promises, but they're empty promises. There's just this tragic, immediate disconnect happening. Politicians and economists are asking for years of patience to fix systemic issues, but citizens like Kirsty, they're tired of living in a cold house and skipping meals today. They literally do not have the luxury of time. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. If the people on the ground, the very ones who desperately need the help, have completely given up on the promises of the establishment, how does a broken nation actually begin to rebuild? It's a profound question about trust, wealth, and the future of British society, and there's definitely no easy answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.